I've been analyzing power transitions for 4 decades, and I've never witnessed a more revealing demonstration of how military success can immediately transform into strategic catastrophe when institutional legitimacy collapses faster than territorial control can be established. What we're observing 24 hours after Trump's Venezuela operation isn't the consolidation of American power, but the acceleration of systemic breakdown that reveals how tactical military capability becomes strategic liability when domestic political systems cannot provide legal foundation for sustained occupation, while international institutions systematically reject the precedent that arbitrary intervention represents. The real story isn't what happened in Caracas during those critical hours when American forces seized Maduro. The real story is what happened in Washington, Beijing, Brussels, and regional capitals in the 24 hours afterward, as the global political architecture began systematically fragmenting around American unilateral action that lacks institutional support from any significant international actor. The moment Trump declared that America would maintain practical control over Venezuela until a suitable transition occurs without congressional authorization or international mandate, every assumption about legal authority and institutional constraint collapsed simultaneously across multiple domains of international relations. This wasn't post conflict stabilization or temporary peacekeeping operation under established international frameworks. This was explicit acknowledgement that American power now operates beyond constitutional limitations and international legal authority while claiming indefinite occupation rights over sovereign territory through purely executive decision making that faces no effective institutional constraint from either domestic or international legal systems designed to prevent exactly this kind of arbitrary territorial control. The legitimacy crisis erupting across American political institutions reveals fundamental contradictions between military capability and legal authority that democratic systems cannot resolve when executive power claims unlimited war-making authority without constitutional oversight. Democratic lawmakers explicitly condemned the operation as war powers violation while possessing no institutional mechanism to reverse territorial occupation that has already been established through military force. Congressional discussions of investigation, legal authority, and long term costs demonstrate institutional paralysis when legislative oversight confronts executive fait accompli that creates ongoing political obligations requiring sustained resource allocation and strategic commitment that democratic systems cannot maintain without public support and legal legitimacy. What makes this constitutional breakdown particularly dangerous for American strategic credibility is how it exposes systematic weakness in democratic institutional architecture when confronted with executive power that claims military necessity supersedes legal constraint. Republican supporters who initially provided tactical support are beginning to recognize that indefinite territorial occupation requires congressional appropriations, legal frameworks, and institutional sustainability that exceed what party loyalty can provide when public opinion faces extended military commitments without clear strategic objectives or defined endpoints for successful completion and withdrawal from hostile territory that requires sustained resource allocation. The international response reveals mathematical impossibility of legitimizing American territorial control when every significant international actor explicitly rejects the precedent that unilateral intervention represents for global stability and legal predictability. Chinese officials have systematically positioned America as an irresponsible actor that threatens sovereignty principles while offering alternative institutional frameworks based on legal equality rather than arbitrary power projection. Russian statements frame the Venezuela operation as fundamental assault on international order rather than regional intervention, providing systematic justification for similar operations whenever great powers face domestic political authorization for territorial expansion through military means rather than international legal process. European strategic calculations expose transatlantic relationship breakdown as alliance partners discover they cannot support American territorial occupation without abandoning legal principles that define their institutional legitimacy and public support requirements. European leaders adopted distancing language emphasizing law, transition, and stability while carefully avoiding direct support for American territorial control that violates sovereignty principles they depend upon for protection from arbitrary intervention by larger military powers. This represents systematic alliance fragmentation where shared security commitments become incompatible with legal frameworks that European integration requires for democratic legitimacy and institutional sustainability. Latin American political transformation reveals regional recognition that the Venezuela operation represents systematic threat to sovereign independence rather than isolated intervention against unpopular authoritarian regime. Countries that privately opposed Maduro now explicitly reject American precedent while calculating their vulnerability to similar operations whenever domestic policies conflict with American strategic objectives or economic interests. The regional consensus that this represents dangerous precedent rather than exceptional circumstance creates systematic opposition to American regional dominance that historically operated through economic pressure and political influence rather than direct territorial occupation that threatens every government's independence. Chinese strategic positioning demonstrates sophisticated understanding of how American institutional breakdown creates systematic opportunities for alternative order construction that emphasizes legal predictability over arbitrary power projection. Beijing's emphasis on sovereignty, international law, and institutional stability provides systematic contrast to American unilateral action while offering alternative frameworks for international relations based on voluntary compliance with legal constraints rather than submission to superpower military dominance. This creates strategic momentum toward multipolar institutional architecture that attracts nations seeking protection from arbitrary intervention through legal frameworks rather than bilateral security relationships with unpredictable partners. The economic implications reveal systematic capital flight from American controlled assets as international investors recognize that indefinite territorial occupation requires resource allocation that democratic political systems cannot sustain when public opinion demands immediate results from military commitments without clear strategic objectives or legal justification for extended engagement. Venezuelan oil infrastructure under American control becomes strategic liability when production costs include ongoing military occupation, political resistance management, and international legal challenges that exceed economic benefits from resource extraction under hostile political conditions requiring sustained military presence. Congressional institutional paralysis demonstrates systematic breakdown of constitutional war powers when executive branch creates military facts that require legislative support without constitutional authorization for territorial occupation that exceeds any previous understanding of presidential authority during peacetime conditions. Democratic criticism of war powers violations proves meaningless when military occupation has already established political obligations requiring sustained appropriations regardless of legal authority for initial intervention. This constitutional crisis reveals democratic institutional weakness when executive power claims military necessity justifies unlimited territorial control without legislative oversight or judicial constraint that could reverse ongoing military commitments. Intelligence agencies face systematic credibility destruction when policy recommendations must support territorial occupation that lacks international legal foundation, while claiming strategic benefits from regional control that requires sustained resource allocation exceeding what American political systems can provide without public support for extended military engagement. Intelligence assessment quality degrades when professional analysis must justify ongoing political commitments rather than provide objective evaluation of strategic costs and benefits from territorial occupation under hostile international and domestic political conditions requiring indefinite resource allocation without clear success metrics. Regional alliance implications reveal systematic fragmentation of American influence as Latin American governments calculate their security requirements based on protection from American intervention rather than cooperation with American strategic objectives that now include territorial occupation whenever domestic political arrangements conflict with executive branch preferences. Countries that historically relied on American economic relationships now develop alternative partnerships that reduce vulnerability to arbitrary intervention through diversified political and economic relationships with powers that offer legal predictability rather than military dominance as foundation for international cooperation. Financial market implications create systematic risk assessment challenges as investors recognize that American territorial occupation under hostile international conditions requires resource allocation that exceeds sustainable fiscal capacity when democratic political systems face public opposition to extended military commitments without legal justification or strategic objectives that justify ongoing costs. Venezuelan asset values under American military control become speculative investments dependent on political sustainability of occupation policies rather than economic fundamentals or market conditions that traditional investment analysis can reliably evaluate. International institutional breakdown accelerates as United Nations and regional organizations discover they possess no enforcement mechanism to reverse territorial occupation by powers that claim domestic legal authority for violation of sovereignty principles while rejecting international legal frameworks that provide institutional protection for smaller states. This systematic institutional failure creates precedent for similar operations by any power possessing sufficient military capability and domestic political authorization for territorial expansion through direct intervention rather than international legal process that requires voluntary compliance with sovereignty constraints. The strategic precedent implications terrify regional powers who recognize that successful American territorial occupation without international legal consequence provides systematic justification for similar operations by China, Russia, and other military powers whenever domestic political conditions authorize territorial expansion through military means rather than international agreement. If America can successfully occupy sovereign territory through executive decision without constitutional oversight or international mandate, every regional power can claim similar authority for territorial control over neighbors that pose strategic challenges or possess valuable resources requiring military rather than economic acquisition methods. European institutional credibility faces systematic destruction as alliance partners discover they cannot maintain legal principles that define democratic legitimacy while supporting territorial occupation that violates sovereignty frameworks their own security depends upon for protection from arbitrary intervention. European Union legal architecture requires respect for sovereignty principles, while NATO alliance obligations create pressure to support American military actions that systematically violate legal frameworks that European integration requires for institutional sustainability and public support maintenance. Alternative institutional momentum reveals systematic global recognition that American led international order has become incompatible with legal predictability and sovereign equality that smaller nations require for independent political development and economic security. BRICS expansion accelerates as nations seek alternative frameworks that provide institutional protection from arbitrary intervention rather than bilateral relationships with powers that claim territorial control authority through military capability rather than international legal process that ensures equal treatment regardless of military weakness compared to superpower capabilities. Economic architecture transformation demonstrates systematic movement toward dollar alternative systems as nations calculate that American currency dominance becomes strategic vulnerability when reserve currency status depends on confidence in legal frameworks that arbitrary territorial occupation systematically destroys through demonstration that international law becomes meaningless when major powers choose military solution over institutional constraint. This creates monetary momentum toward alternative payment systems that operate independently of institutions that American military power can manipulate through territorial occupation threats. The systematic breakdown extends beyond immediate Venezuelan occupation into global recognition that American institutional architecture can no longer provide legal predictability or sovereign equality that international cooperation requires for sustainable economic development and political independence. When democratic superpowers abandon constitutional constraints while claiming territorial control authority through military capability, international relations revert to pure power competition where legal frameworks become irrelevant compared to military preparation for resistance against arbitrary intervention by powers that operate beyond institutional limitation. Congressional appropriations battles reveal systematic domestic opposition to indefinite territorial occupation costs when public opinion demands immediate withdrawal from military commitments that lack legal justification while requiring sustained resource allocation for hostile territory management under international political opposition. Democratic political systems cannot maintain territorial occupation when electoral constituencies oppose ongoing military spending for objectives that exceed constitutional authority while providing no clear strategic benefits that justify extended engagement under hostile conditions requiring indefinite resource commitment. This analysis suggests that 24 hours after tactical military success, Trump's Venezuela operation has triggered systematic institutional breakdown across domestic constitutional architecture, international alliance relationships, and regional political arrangements that create strategic disaster exceeding any possible benefit from territorial occupation under hostile political conditions. The legitimacy crisis reveals that modern democratic superpowers cannot successfully maintain territorial occupation without legal foundation and international support that American institutional breakdown has systematically destroyed through arbitrary executive power that operates beyond constitutional constraint while rejecting international legal frameworks that provide legitimacy for territorial control under voluntary compliance rather than military domination. The implications extend to every aspect of American international influence as nations recognize that partnership with powers that claim territorial occupation authority through military capability rather than legal process creates systematic vulnerability to arbitrary intervention whenever domestic political arrangements conflict with superpower strategic objectives that executive authority defines without institutional constraint or international legal consideration. We are witnessing controlled demolition of American institutional credibility through military action that achieved tactical success, while creating strategic catastrophe that systematically destroys foundation for international cooperation and domestic political legitimacy that sustained American influence requires for effective global leadership in competitive international